I live in a small town, the type where everyone knows your name. Funny thing about places like these, work for teenagers can be a little tricky to find. I turned 17 in June and I've been steadily looking for a part-time job since then. There have been a few that looked promising, but there was always something that made it unviable. That's when I saw the advertisement in a store window. Help wanted, server and team member at the World's End Diner. Along with this, there was an address stapled to the side. 1683 Old Wood Drive. I decided I'd give it a look and I went in person the next day. I parked my car in the back and walked around to take a look at the place. I was a little less than thrilled. The diner had the look of an old 50s style roadside diner. Pastel blue walls and an old neon sign out front. The walls themselves were covered in spider webs and a thick layer of dust which seemed to permeate throughout the air. I opened the door and was greeted by a young and pretty woman at the counter. "Hello sir, what would you like today?" This struck me as a little odd given I hadn't even taken a seat at that point. But I wasn't going to turn down a moderately paying job because of a little weirdness. Yeah, the words stumbled out while I tried to think of something to say. "I saw your guy's ad in the paper." A look of confusion washed across her face and I thought that perhaps I had gotten the wrong address. After a few seconds of awkward silence, the back door opened and an old man walked out. "What's your business here, boy?" he grumbled out with a gravely voice and a face to match. The man himself was tall with a set of overalls and a name tag that I couldn't read. Definitely an interesting uniform for a diner, I thought. "Well, I saw your advert in the paper and came to take a look at that." The old man's face turned to a smile as he moved toward the counter. "That's great," he said with an almost childlike grin. "Come right in and we can have a talk." We both walked past the young lady as we went into what I assumed was the man's office. "The name's Thomas. And the girl you saw up front is Ruby." I nodded at this and made a mental note to remember them. I've always been bad with names. As soon as I entered the office, the cold hit me, almost icy. I felt it enter my lungs and almost freeze my throat. Mind the cold. It can get a little icy in here sometimes. Thomas seemed almost unbothered by it, which weirded me out by no small amount, as by this point I was shaking like a madman. "Have a seat, son," he gestured toward one of the two solitary chairs in the office. I sat down as he did and we began to exchange words. "Now son," the man began, but I quickly interjected, "My name is Jay." I didn't mean to be rude, but I felt it was important to establish myself to prove I wasn't a pushover. "Well, Jay, if you want this job, I can tell you right now you've got it." I was incredibly surprised at this, and it was obvious that it was showing on my face as the old man continued. "Don't look so surprised. We don't get a lot of applications, so we'll be happy to take you." "What's the pay?" $17 an hour plus tips." "I'll take it. I can start as soon as you're ready to have me." That was the last of it. Thomas gave me a slip of paper and told me to memorize it. It was at this point that I realized why the pay was so damn good. It wasn't the usual employee guide of do's and don'ts. It was a list of rules, and a weird one at that. The paper went as follows. Employee Rule Book. All you need to know before you can begin your service journey. Rule number 1. We offer no refunds, no matter what. If anyone asks, you must refuse no matter how insistent. Rule number 2. We close at 6 p.m. with no exceptions. If someone claims to be an exception, they should be thrown out immediately. Rule number 3. If a man claiming to be the manager gives you the day off, tell him you'll be happy to keep working. If he continues to insist, press the small button underneath the desk. Rule number 4. If anyone leaves a tip using dead man's coins, place them in the donation box and they'll be removed by Thomas at the end of the shift. Rule number 5. You only have one co-worker, Ruby. Rule number 6. The lights should never go out. If they do, press the red button and pray they don't see you. Rule number 7. If a smiling man enters the store, inform him that his meal is on the house. If he refuses, ask him to leave politely. Don't anger him. Rule number 8. When preparing food, make sure to avoid any of the wrong ingredients. Rule number 9. Never unlock the back door for anyone. No matter the reason, anyone who needs to use it will have a key on hand. Rule number 10. We do not sell human meat. If a person should ask for such a product, kindly ask them to leave. If they don't leave, you have permission to use the rifle located underneath the counter. This is not a comprehensive list. You are expected to learn the more precise aspects on the job. We hope you will join us in this service journey. Hours 8 a.m. 6 p.m. This is where the notice ended. And needless to say, I was completely floored. Not only did it seem incredibly insane, it looked like a complete joke. At this point, I was completely against going back in, until I remembered the pay. I won't lie and say that I'm proud of my decision, but I figured I could put up with a joke if I was being paid $17 an hour. The following Monday, I went back into the diner. the pastel blue walls and spider webs there to greet me. I opened the door and the bell chimed to mark my entry. Entry to what seemed to be an old empty roadside diner. "Mr. Thomas, I'm here." My voice echoed through the empty diner and resonated in my ears as it came back to me. I walked to the counter slowly. I felt like any movement too sudden might somehow alert something to my presence, something that isn't meant to be there. A feeling of dread filled me completely. I'm not normally someone prone to irrational fear, but I couldn't help it. After reading those strange rules and going into such a weird place, it only felt natural. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Thomas' voice cut through the eerie silence like a guillotine. His voice was shrill and filled with fear. "Well, I thought I would come in after hours so I wouldn't disturb the customers with our meeting," I answered quickly and defensively. I didn't mean to be defensive, but I was more than a little embarrassed by being so scared of the empty diner. "Didn't you read the damn rules, boy? We close at 6, no exceptions." "Damn it," his voice again came from the office. This time a little more at ease, but that same urgency and anxiousness still remained. "Get back here, boy. Before they see you, before who see me." I thought, it's just me and him here. I was initially going to laugh and play it all off as a joke on the new guy. Then I remembered the rules. Rule number 6. The lights should never go out. If they do, press the red button under and pray they don't see you. I said, "Get back here, damn it." Thomas' voice shot through the darkness of the diner and almost knocked me flat on my ass with the shock. I quickly walked through to the back of the counter, bumping past the stools to do so. The same cold air from the other day flowing through the entirety of the diner at this point. I made it to the door of Thomas' office and quickly opened it. The screech of the handle turning sent sharp needle-like sound directly into my ear. The door swung open to find Thomas behind the singular desk in his office, crouched beneath it. "What's going on?" By this point, my voice was nothing more than a faint whisper, seemingly afraid of something that I had no idea was even real. Rule 6, nitwit. "Get back here before they see." I ran behind the desk to join Thomas. The space there was less than great, but by now my heart was beating so damn fast I thought I might just keel over right then and there. "What's the plan?" I whispered this directly to Thomas, so closely that I could smell the old man cologne he had on. "We pray they don't see us." Thomas said this with a look of defeat in his face, like this was the last time he'd ever say anything. Then I realized that was the case. This may be the last time either of us say anything. That's when my heart really started racing. A deep sinking feeling went all through my body. It felt like my soul was sinking with it. Not only that, but the fear. Up to this point, I'd never been so damn scared in my life. It was like I couldn't move a muscle no matter how hard I tried. "Quit shacking so damn much. They'll see us." This may have been comforting under normal circumstance. Except this time the voice didn't come from Thomas. It came from outside the door. At this I looked over at Thomas. His face now a ghostly shade of pale, like something had taken all of the color out of it in an instant, leaving him only a gaunt ghost. That wasn't me." Thomas blurted it out in a broken stutter. He was shuddering as well now. Not from the cold, but the fear. It looked like Thomas had lost control. Before that it was like he had known what was going on, but after that it was out the window. "It's okay. The lights will come back on soon." The voices echoing through the darkness outside the office, almost trying to beckon us outside of it. "You can come out now. It's safe for you, Jay." This voice was ghastly and soft, a shrill, piercing voice which shook me to my core. Thomas also looked at me now, his face contorted into a deep scowl as if wondering how they knew my name just as I was. "They've never spoken before, and now they know your name." His voice, while still a whisper, was accusatory, like I somehow had any idea what the fuck was going on. Before I had the chance to defend myself, something stopped us. The screech of the doorknob being pulled sent a shiver right down my spine as goosebumps raced up my arms to match. Both Thomas and I instinctively peered over the top of the desk, the doorknob turning slowly and deliberately until it had seemingly been an hour. A few more seconds passed, the doorknob slowly turning until an audible click was heard. The door jolted a tiny bit as the bolt unclasped and the door slowly creaked open, a loud screech following it as it opened, clearly in need of some oil, I thought. And then there it was. 4 incredibly long and thin gray fingers protruded from the darkness behind the door, grasping it and pushing it open to reveal whatever monster lay behind. The darkness obscured most of the monster, as well as just about everything else beyond the door. It had seemingly appeared from nowhere, but it was by then impermeable. From what could be seen, it was obvious it wasn't human, only some sort of bastardization of the human form, like a sick recreation. What I assumed was the face had a mouth from ear to ear, though it was less of a mouth and more a dent in the flesh, having no teeth or even a hole inside to speak of. The torso bore a picket black suit and a red tie. though it was incredibly long and out of proportion. The arms were what I feared most. Enormous and long, easily stretching 5 meters for each, topped off by the enormous fingers that grabbed at the door. Thomas gasped at the sight, but it caught in his throat almost immediately, clearly too scared to give away our location. As for myself, I had almost seized entirely by this point as the monster opened the door further, the familiar screech of the rusty hinges only unsettling us further. "Don't mind me, just wanting to get a look at the new recruit," the same soft voice emanated from the beast. Though I don't have a clue from where, the inside of the office now had a sickly sweet smell. The smell of decay which the creature had probably tracked in, and it wafted through the air and almost made me gag. "We'll be seeing you with this." The creature sunk back through the darkness behind the office door and slowly disappeared from sight. Its long, nimbly fingers were the last to follow, but they too soon joined it. Both Thomas and I now sat in the empty office once again. The darkness soon retreated as the light began entering once more and returned the small office to its natural state. The sickly sweet smell remained for some time afterward, however, and wouldn't fully dissipate until a few days later. Thomas looked to me as we still sat beneath the desk. "Dumbfounded. That's new," was all he managed to say. I didn't exactly know which part he thought was new, and honestly I didn't really feel like guessing. "They never speak, and you normally don't come out of it alive." Thomas' voice was distant this time, which I guess is fair considering we just survived the unsurvivable. "So, am I good to come into work tomorrow?" I joked around. I didn't have any intention of ever returning to this place. "If we see you tomorrow, you've got the job and a pay rise." "How much?" "19 an hour. I'll see you at 7 sharp. Welcome to the world's end, Jay." That was the end of the conversation, and there would be no way in hell that I would be staying here after hours, so I quickly made my way outside of the office, almost definitely leaving my disbelief in the paranormal behind. This was my first experience with what happens when you don't respect the rules. Next time I wasn't so lucky. Yesterday was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. I had an encounter with rule number 6, and it looks like it won't be the last time you'll see them. If you're confused, check out my first post here. I got up early today. My alarm was the first thing I heard, blaring into my ear at 6:30 in the morning. Immediately the cold morning air hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt like shivering under the covers. I quickly took off my blankets and got into some nicer clothes. I wasn't entirely sure if the diner had any sort of uniform, so I just put on some of my street clothes and hoped I didn't look too out of place. I got into my car and made my way to the diner. The address, 1683 Old Wood Drive, stuck into my mind like glue. The diner is located just off the only highway anywhere near my town. I drove through the turnoff and down the small country road which followed, and it led me right back to the old diner. I parked close to the diner this time around. It wasn't like I was particularly far last time, but I wanted a quick getaway if the situation required it. I walked to the entrance and was greeted by the old neon sign and the ever-growing collection of cobwebs. I opened the door and the bell chimed its regular chime. "So you decided to show up?" Ruby said in a surprising tone. I had guessed this would be the reaction. After all, you'd have to be insane to take a job like this. Well, I figured I should at least give it a go. This wasn't exactly true. The real reason was that I had my eyes on a new game for a while now, and I needed the cash. "Well, come behind the counter and I'll show you the ropes." Ruby said this with a helpful and kind voice, and admittedly it relaxed me a bit to know I wasn't the only normal-ish person here. I walked past the tables and chairs to the counter. Those same tables and chairs had scared me so much in the empty and silent darkness. Yet there they were in their benign innocence yet again. As I walked toward the counter, I felt a tension around me. Not of any supernatural interference or anything of the sort. Mainly just the reality of starting a new job with people I don't really know. I was incredibly nervous as I stepped up to the counter and hoped it wasn't too obvious. But knowing my face's willingness to give away my feelings, it seemed likely that Ruby had noticed. I jumped the counter, as there didn't appear to be any reasonable method of accessing it that I could see. At this, Ruby began showing me some of the basics. "This is the register. It registers things," as she said this. A smile crept on her lips and eventually we both started chuckling. It was a pretty crappy joke, but it helped ease the tension a little. It was apparent that it was an awkward experience for both of us, which helped a bit. Ruby showed me the basics for about an hour, this being how long we had until the diner would start accepting customers. Nothing was particularly difficult. Things like when someone comes in, greet them immediately. If they're an evil entity, it should become apparent in their response. Normal diner things were sparsely interjected as well. Stuff like make sure to brew the coffee black, If they want milk or sugar, they'll ask for it. It seemed obvious, but I guess she hadn't ever really trained a new recruit before opening the diner. As Ruby was walking to flip the sign from closed to open, she turned to me and spoke. "One more thing. If we get one of the more dangerous regulars, I'll take care of them." She turned back and continued to do the opening procedures. While Ruby was opening up, I began thinking, what did she mean by regulars? Did she mean the people in the roles? I was just about to ask her as the bell chimed. A loud ring shot through the diner, far louder than the small bell should have been able to produce. "Hello, sir." "Just the regular again." Ruby's voice shot out quickly. It was strained and her face looked nervous. I looked over at the man who had elicited such a response. A small man with a brown overcoat. I looked toward his face. And that was when I noticed it. The man didn't have a face. Ruby quickly made her way to the counter, stopping only to pull out a chair for the man to sit on. She cleared the counter and turned to me. "I'll deal with him. You make the pancakes." Ruby said this with a steadfast determination, like it was life or death. I made my way to the preparation area for the pancakes. I poured a generous amount of batter and began cooking them. Ruby was ensuring to keep an eye on the man. As she did, she motioned for me to come to her. I left the pancake to sizzle while I approached and asked, "Who is he?" "He's not in the rules." My voice was a hushed whisper, afraid that I might somehow anger the man who was now seated only 6 or 7 meters from the counter. Ruby looked at me sharply, glaring deep into my eyes as she did so. "He's Rule 13. Didn't you read the employee guide?" She nearly shouted this. As much as someone can shout in the tone of a whisper. "I'll handle this. And then we're gonna have a long chat about respecting the damn rules." Ruby was furious. Given the circumstance, I could understand. I was putting our lives in danger with my ignorance. I walked back to the pancakes as Ruby went back to tending to the faceless man. She did this in the form of small talk, though as she did so her face remained creased in effort, as though it was taking a toll on her. I flipped the first pancake and poured a second helping of batter onto the right side of the pan. I again left the pancakes to their own devices, though this time I only looked at Ruby and the man. Ruby was asking seemingly random things to the man. "How are the kids? What's the weather like there? Are you still with Marie?" She fired these questions off one after another, though it looked like she knew what she was doing despite the absurdity. The faceless man remained seated, clearly waiting for his pancakes as he was paying no attention to Ruby's rapid-fire questionnaire. I turned back to the pancakes for a moment. I flipped the second and took the first off the heat and placed it on a plate. I turned back to continue looking at Ruby and the man with no face, only to find as I did that Ruby was gone. I quickly turned my body to face the faceless man. "Where is my co-worker?" The words left my mouth quickly. The man paid them no mind. "Where is she?" I shouted this time. Again, no reaction. I walked toward him with a frenzied pace. "You're not supposed to ask." That the words were slow and deliberate, and they emanated an intense loathing toward me. I was taken aback by them and again continued my approach. "That's not what you're supposed to ask." He repeated the phrase, quicker this time. I stopped, not wanting to push my luck further. I noticed the sweat on my brow. I was feeling fear again, my nerves starting to fail. "Your friend is well, but you are in violation." The pancakes had stopped sizzling by now. Not because they were done or burnt, but because they too were no longer there. The faceless man raised his head and I got a better look at both him and the effects that had begun to manifest. The windows had been covered with blinds, and the light that had once filled the diner was now all but gone. The chairs and stools once again took up their sinister forms. I was afraid. As for the man, he still had his trench coat and his face was still alarmingly absent from view. But now it was clear why. While his face before was only a singular mass of darkness, it now was more clear to see. The darkness still obscured most of where his face should be, but where his eyes should have been now had runic symbols, almost impossible to see and yet glaringly obvious. Where the mouth should have been was a crosswork of stitches, crisscrossing each other to sew tight whatever was once there. The man walked toward me, his shadowed face looking directly into my eyes. His steps were deliberate and slow as he paced toward me. "Stay the hell away from me." I have no idea how I managed to blurt this out. My nerve had long since crumbled and I was only functioning on instinct. My breathing heaved as my body was ready for a fight or flight response. My words didn't deter him as he continued his pursuit. By now my heart was going haywire, shooting against my chest as I stood still. I backed up against the wall and felt the hung-up pans clatter as I crashed into them. The faceless man reached the stools, now less than a single meter away from me. I looked deeper into his face now, perhaps looking for some human feature to ground my fear. The stitched mouth creased to a frown as he continued to stare at me. "Please leave me alone," I almost whimpered at this point. I had no idea what it intended to do with me, but I really didn't want to find out. He reached an arm over the counter and held out his hand. Receive punishment. Or be damned, he unclasped his hand to reveal a small black stone, the same runic stone which were present on his eyes. I stepped back again, crashing into the pots once more, the sounds of which echoed through the diner. Take it. Or be damned, he repeated yet another phrase. I knew better than to refuse a request from something like this. I reached out my hand, now shaking with fear and anticipation. My hand hovered above his for a brief moment. I grabbed the small stone in his hand. The moment my hand made contact, the stone crumbled. The man retracted his hand and began walking back to his seat. I, on the other hand, didn't fare nearly as well. A cold pain shot up my hand quickly. I lost all feeling in my fingers as the pain approached my shoulder. The rest of my body felt numb as my head clouded. The reality of the situation dissipated as everything became abstract. The pain finally rested on my eye as I lost any of what remained of my senses. I lost consciousness quickly after that. Whatever happened in the interim was lost to me. It was Ruby's voice that awakened me. The sense of pain was lost to me as I readjusted to my surroundings. What? My mouth somehow moved in reply to her as I was filled with the grogginess that came with waking. The pain being nothing more than a bad memory. Your eye, Ruby said it solemnly as she gazed in my direction. The words didn't fully dawn on me until the cloudiness of my mind allowed me to remember. I quickly reached my hand to my face and grabbed it where my eye should have been in desperation. Nothing. It wasn't as though it has been removed from the socket entirely. It was as if it had never been there at all. I felt the now empty section of my face again. Nothing but skin, now covering the place where my right eye had once been. Only an etched marking remained. I turned toward Ruby, looking desperately in hopes that she could somehow fix it all. It's gone, Jay. She looked toward the floor as she said this, unable to deliver news like this directly to my face. In response, I looked away as well. I couldn't face someone in my current state. We still have work to do, you know. She said this slowly, but with a slightly hopeful tone, trying her best to help me forget. Yeah. Just give me a minute. I needed to sit for a minute to take in what happened. I didn't get that chance. Another loud ding erupted from the bell. At first I thought the faceless man had now reappeared to take my other eye. I looked up at the man who had now entered the diner and quickly shot out the words, "Hello, sir. What can we do for you today?" The words left quickly and suddenly before I really had a chance to consider what I had said. "I would like your finest meat, sir. I believe Caucasian will do nicely." The man spoke with an English accent, something not entirely uncommon. What concerned me was what he had asked. "What do you mean, sir?" I stammered confusingly to the man, who was beginning to look confused himself. "What else could I mean, my boy? A serving of human meat." With this, the carnival of crazy officially resumed. It was Ruby who broke the intermittent silence which had sprung up after the man's request. "We don't serve that here, sir." Her voice was steadfast as she said this, confident. The man was baffled and quickly becoming irritated, with a scowl replacing his look of confusion. "I'm quite sure you do, young lady," the man said insistently and confidently, his annoyance presenting itself in his voice. It was then that I began to recall the rules. Rule number 10. We do not sell human meat. If a person should ask for such a product, kindly ask them to leave. If they don't leave, you have permission to use the rifle located underneath the counter. The words echoed through my mind. The back and forth of Ruby and the Englishman continued. "You do sell it, young lady, we do not, old man." It seemed the argument would continue forever. That was until I realized how to cut things short. I bent under the counter, scrounging through the mugs and plates that were kept under there. As I pushed away the last mug, my hand gripped the butt of the rifle, the wooden stock feeling hard and dense in my hand as I did so. "I am not leaving until I am served." The Englishman shouted this with distinction at Ruby, who was now clearly just as annoyed as he was. "We're going to have to ask you to leave, sir." Ruby said this with a finality in her voice, clearly done with the man. "This is rule number 10, right?" I looked to my superior for affirmation. She simply nodded in response. "I have already told you, sir. I shall not leave until I am served." With this final confirmation, I raised the rifle and let loose a single shot, which buried into the man's chest, the sound of the shot echoing through the diner and in my ears, a ringing sound now clearly audible. I turned to Ruby once more, a smile now covering her face. "I hate those assholes," even let out a chuckle at that. As for the man, what I assumed was a man at least, he had now fallen, slumped over on the ground where he had stood, a thick and viscous black liquid escaping from the bullet hole I lodged in the man's chest. "What do we do now?" I asked this to Ruby, as I wasn't entirely sure where to go from here. Well, normally they disappear by the end of the day. But first we should close the shop. Both Ruby and I closed the diner together, taking care to avoid the liquid steadily spewing from the man's corpse. Eventually, we had finished all of the closing procedures, losing almost an entire day of business because of the event. With that finished, I decided to check on my eye one last time, still quite depressed with its loss, as I raised my hand and felt the runic shape etched into my skin. Ruby, who was on the other side of the diner putting away the utensils, turned to me. "You violated the rules. These are the consequences." Again her pitiful expression returned. "Clearly sorry for me. I thought rule number 10 was the last rule," I said defensively, hoping to stop her from blaming me too much for the event. "Didn't you read the manual?" Ruby said, puzzled. "I didn't even receive a manual." A look of shock crossed her face, clearly unaware that she had worked half her shift with someone that could have killed us both. "Okay. Well, you can borrow mine for now, until we can get you one of your own." At this she left and entered Thomas' office, who was still on break after the shock of the previous day. After a few minutes of rummaging around, Ruby returned from the office holding a small and thin notebook. A brown hardcover book that looked old enough to crumble to dust at a particularly strong gust of wind. "Take this and remember as many rules as you can. A lot of people died to get that list." Ruby looked me in the eye as she handed me the notebook. I took it in my hand and placed it in my pocket, the weight surprisingly hefty considering its size. "So are we good to go?" I gestured toward the door when I asked, ensuring my intentions were known. "Yeah, when this happens we normally leave early. Our regulars will know what happened when they see the door is locked." The feeling of normalcy returned as she said this. The day finally over with its craziness. Both Ruby and I didn't remain long. She quickly grabbed her purse and left, myself following her soon after. I lost an eye today at the World's End Diner. I wouldn't be so foolish again. I had an encounter with rule number 13 yesterday. The faceless man. I paid the price with my right eye, and I don't think I'll be getting it back. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe start here. The small notebook Ruby had given me now sat in front of me, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up from my table to quickly skim through it. As I did so, Ruby's words echoed through my mind. "Take this and remember as many rules as you can. A lot of people died to get that list." Who had died? How many had died? Did they all work at the diner? All of those questions raced through my mind. Maybe if I looked through the book I may be able to get an idea of what Ruby was talking about. And maybe I might be able to understand what these things are. The first pages of the book were filled with regular diner protocol, as well as reiterating the first 10 rules. I continued looking through, in hopes of finding something new, or an answer to one or all of my questions. About halfway through the thin and yellow book there sat a large title, Advanced Rules and Information. This was good. It might be the answer I was looking for. I turned to the next page, my heart beginning to race with excitement. Rules for a successful shift. Rule number 11. The dark ones arrive on every other full moon. They aren't to be ignored. Answer their questions and they will leave. Rule number 12. If a tall dark figure begins to be seen around the diner, turn on the backup lights immediately. Rule number 13. If a man without a face arrives, ask him pleasant questions. How is your day? How's Margaret? How are the kids? Make 3 pancakes with maple syrup to go along with this. Do not burn the pancakes. Rule number 14. Anyone who knocks on the door of the diner is not to be granted entry. They are not human. Rule number 15. If your shadow disappears, make sure to ignore it. It will come back if you do so. Thank you for your continued support. Feel free to add to the list by contacting your local manager. This was all there was. More damned rules. I looked through the remaining pages of the notebook, scrambling to find anything which could help me, anything that could give me answers. There was nothing, not a single clue. I looked at the book from front to back. Nothing that I didn't know or hadn't already seen. I felt defeated, as though I could do nothing to find the answers and I was damned to be victim to these monsters until I leave. A sinking feeling washed over me. My heart slowed and I began to consider giving up. Could I give up? Could I just not show up to work? This seemed simple, of course. I could not show up. After all, it's not like they can get me at my home, can they? It was a question I preferred not to have answered. I decided to at least follow Ruby's advice, figuring that I could at least be helpful and stop putting everyone's lives in danger. I felt hopeful with this conviction. I wanted to at least be good at dealing with all of this bad. I went through the book again, reading over not only the new rules but the old ones as well, doing my best to familiarize myself with their contents. I kept up with this for hours, only stopping to eat and drink. Soon enough I knew each and every rule like the back of my hand. I wouldn't lose another eye. After about 3 hours of quizzing myself on the rules and reading the notebook, I felt comfortable enough to let myself sleep, ready for another day's work. Sleep came easily that night, the sunken feeling all but gone as I embraced the wave of sleep which followed. I woke early in the morning, earlier than usual as it was still somewhat dark outside. I checked my watch, 5:06. That's way too early for me. I chalked it up to my excitement last night, my conviction to make myself useful in the diner. I got my diner clothes on and got into my car and made my way to the diner, down the highway and through the turnoff to make my way down the old country road. I parked in the same spot I did yesterday. Even with my newfound confidence, I wasn't going to let myself get cocky. The neon sign blared into the morning air, a fine steam visible thanks to its light. The pastel blue walls were there to greet me, as well as the cobwebs which I was beginning to grow rather fond of. I pulled the handle and opened the door, the ding of the bell scaring me as I did so. "We're still closed, damn it," Thomas' gruff voice shot out through his office. "I know, sir. It's just me," I shouted back as I walked into the diner proper, making my way through the cold of the diner to the counter. "Oh, sorry about that, son." Still a little on edge after what happened, his voice was apologetic, clearly not meaning to offend me. "It's all right, sir. I don't blame you." Ruby arrived not long after me. She parked her car not too far from mine. In fact, as she entered, both her and Thomas had a similar exchange as ours prior. And then we got to setting up the diner for service. Ruby took care of the table and chairs as I started taking care of the pots and pans. The rest of the cooking material came next. Both of us helped with this. Throughout all of this, Thomas sat in his office mulling over paperwork and looking at footage of the diner, while we worked on getting the diner ready for opening. A knocking began at the back door. It started off slight, almost unintelligible, but it was growing louder. "Is there someone at the back door?" I whispered to Ruby in a hushed tone. "Probably a rule number 9. Don't worry about it." Her tone was dismissive. It probably wasn't a problem. After all, it probably wasn't very dangerous if we stuck to the rules. The knocking continued for the remainder of our setting up, eventually manifesting into bohemian hollering and slamming against the door, ordering us to unlock it. Not this time, evil monster thingy. Both Ruby and I finished the setup with little to no problem, the knocking eventually subsiding into silence. After the setting up, Ruby opened the diner, and I figured I had a bit of free time before the first customer. So I went towards Thomas' office. "Mr. Thomas, can we talk?" I shouted out just outside the door, hearing some quick cursing from Thomas as I did. "Are you trying to kill me, Jay? Just open the door like a normal person." I did as Thomas asked and entered the office. The lonely desk and chairs were a familiar sight, though today a mounted rifle had been mounted to the wall, probably to help Thomas feel safer. "I just wanted to ask you a few things about the monsters." That is, I felt like a little kid as I said this, like I was asking for permission to use the bathroom, but I needed to know about them, no matter the cost. "They're not monsters, you idiot. They're customers." Thomas sounded forthright as he said this, like he wanted to end the conversation immediately. "Some of them are. But what about the ones that aren't?" Again, I felt the feeling of being a kid, like I shouldn't be asking something like this. But I persisted. "And what about the one that took my eye?" Thomas continued his silence, a look of pity covering his face. "I can't tell you too much. You're not management yet, so you only get to know the basics." Thomas regained his composure, doing his best to keep from letting on his compassion. "They're the leftovers from the cafe. The cafe deals with the big issues, and we deal with what's left." He trailed off near the end, clearly unable to continue. "What cafe?" I said quickly, desperately needing the answer. "You don't get to know that yet." I tried to form a response. I wanted to argue the point until the bell interrupted me. The same loud ding shot through the store, impossibly loud just as always. "Hello, sir. How may I help you today?" Ruby greeted the customer as I exited the office. "I just came to inform you two that you can take the day off." The man spoke quickly and sharply, with a thick Irish accent. I looked toward the man, who wore a stained white shirt and a pair of old ripped jeans. "It's okay, sir. We'll be happy to keep working," I said quickly, remembering the rules. Rule number 3. If a man claiming to be the manager gives you the day off, tell him you'll be happy to keep working. If he continues to insist, press the small button underneath the desk. "Well, I appreciate the work ethic, you too. Accept a hefty bonus this year," he said as he gestured toward us. With this, the man started to leave. Ruby and I looked at each other, slightly disbelieving that it was so easy to get rid of him. The man exited the store through the front and Ruby began food prep. pulling out everything needed to make pancakes. After making pancakes and a few other things for the diner, both I and Ruby took our break. A few people had come in, mostly normal customers with the occasional human flesh seeker. There was also someone tipping in dead man's coins, for the most part. It was pretty uneventful. I and Ruby sat behind the counter, pulling out the foldable chairs which were kept for just this occasion. I wanted to get to know my co-worker better, so I decided to ask a few things about working here. Hey Ruby, you talked about the regulars around here. What are they like? I tried to sound happy, or at least nice. But Ruby's face quickly turned to a look of surprise. Well, mostly the regulars are normal people, but they can also be friendly versions of the creatures. This response surprised me a lot. Friendly versions? There are nice ones. Maybe they could help me understand things around here, but you described them as dangerous. They are dangerous. You just need to make sure not to piss them off. I sat there for a moment, trying my best to think of something that could piss off something like them. My answer, just about anything. How do you piss them off? I asked yet another question. This time Ruby's reply was a lot more solemn. Well, the last guy forgot to add butter to one of their pancakes. I was taken aback. Who the hell was the last guy? And what happened to him? My mind again clouded with questions. Completely unsure if I wanted to pursue my idea to question them. I wanted to ask all of these questions. I wanted to find out everything. But I liked Ruby and I didn't want to bother her with all of my questions. I decided instead to bother Thomas. This time I would wait, however. Wait until after my shift. We continued the rest of our break without much happening. We got to know each other a bit better, which was great. I even found out Ruby has a puppy. The break ended and we went back to work, continuing the shift with only a few occurrences of the rules. By now, though, we were able to deal with them without any problem. Throughout the latter half of the shift, we had 2 dead man's coins tips, another human flesh eater, as well as 1 occurrence of disappearing shadows. All of this would have nearly killed me on my first day, but I was improving. I needed to if I wanted to survive after all. The shift ended at 8. A long day's work behind us. This was also my first time working a full shift, so I was pretty tired. We closed the diner pretty quickly this time around. My experience definitely saving some time with it. Ruby said goodbye to Thomas first and left for her car. I said goodbye next. Initially, I wanted to ask him a few things, but I figured I wouldn't get much out of him. I left through the parking lot and into my car, closely parked as I had left it. I worked my first shift today. Next time, I found answers instead. I finally got through a day of work yesterday, dealing with just about every horrible monster under the sun. I also learned about the cafe. If you're confused, maybe you should check out the beginning here. Yesterday I had a conversation with Thomas. It was interrupted pretty quickly, but he mentioned something. They're the leftovers from the cafe. The cafe deals with the big issues, and we deal with what's left. What was the cafe? And what the hell were the big issues? I was thinking hard as I went to sleep that night, slowly letting sleep take me into its hold. I probably woke up a few times that night, tossing and turning as I slept uncomfortably in my bed. I woke up completely not long into the night, looking around my small room as I did so. The room was encompassed in darkness, thick and unyielding to the light of the moon as my window lay open. I sat up in my bed, still looking into the impossible darkness as I did so. My heart sank when I tried looking outside of my room. Where are you, Jay? We know you're in here. It was rule number 6. Rule number 6. The lights should never go out. If they do, press the red button and pray they don't see you. This shouldn't even apply to my home, much less while I sleep. But there they were, in their black suits with their smiling faces, the long arms that reached and grabbed at anything as they maneuvered their way through my home. The darkness now sat everyone inside and outside my room, all-encompassing. The presence of the darkness weighed heavily on me like a weight had been placed on top of me. I could barely see anything, the only thing giving away the monster's presence being their movements and the sound they made. My nerve had been shattered by now. I was completely unable to do anything. I sat in my bed, stiff as a board and incapable of movement. My heart was slamming against my chest, straining to get out. Come on, Jay. We're gonna find you soon. I turned my head to look at the monster as it said this, slowly looking toward the entrance to my room, my heart starting to beat even faster as I turned, knowing what would meet my gaze once I finally saw the entrance. I felt my hands shake wildly, joined by my legs quickly as well. Our eyes locked, my nerves shattered. My heart seized, the dented flesh of the creature's mouth staring back at me, the vacant eyes meeting mine, the creature's long arms holding either side of the doorway. I saw the flesh of the creature's smile crease into a smile as it looked at its prey. "We found you," the omnipresent weight finally compressed, falling onto me as the creature's low voice spoke its final phrase. The stress of the situation finally hit its peak. With this, the monsters would finally end everything for me. That isn't what happened. The darkness remained as ever present as it always had, but the moon now shone as well. It was as though the creature couldn't manifest the darkness and its form properly in unison. I only noticed this thanks to my racing mind, which had been on full alert ever since I locked eyes with the creature. It started moving toward me at that point. As soon as I figured something out, it decided to make good on my expectations and finally kill me. I couldn't let this happen. I finally regained my nerve, the hope of being able to fight back, filling me with the determination I needed. I threw my covers at the monster as it approached, somehow blinding it in my efforts despite its lack of eyes. With my covers gone, I was free to escape the prison of my bed. I jumped quickly in the direction of the window, the very same window that the light of the moon had previously shone through. I shattered my own window with my bare arms, cutting and scraping them as I did so. I then leapt through it to escape the beast which pursued me, which had freed itself from its linen cage. I made a break for my car as soon as the cold air hit me, my feet slamming against the cold concrete below. I threw open my car door and jumped inside. The keys in the glove box, I quickly inserted them into the ignition and started the car. I looked back at my house, in hopes that the creatures would dematerialize after my leave. I stared into my window as I pressed on the gas, the shapes inside moving quickly out of the room. They were leaving. My car raced down the country road that led to my house, slowly on my way to the highway. I needed to get to the diner. I might be safer there, as backwards as it might seem to go toward the diner, a place where monsters seem to go as a focal point. I also figured it would be my best choice, given that the only two people on the planet who can help me will eventually show up there for work. It was a long trip, not in the sense that it took a great amount of time, more so that my mind had to recover from the abject terror which I was just subject to. The gentle hum of the engine accompanied me throughout the journey to the diner, the normality comforting me and returning my heart to a reasonable pace. Through the journey, I recovered to a normal state, the adrenaline leaving me finally. I arrived at the diner and checked my watch, somehow having neglected to do so earlier. 6:15. That's not too early actually. That's good at least. I made my way to the door, using my employee key to open the door. "What in the hell are you doing here, boy?" Thomas' voice shot out from behind the counter before I could even enter the diner proper. "Why in the hell are you here, sir?" I replied quickly, slightly scared at his presence. "I work here, you idiot." I immediately felt stupid for asking. Of course, he was here early. He's the manager. "Now tell me what in God's name you're doing here so damn early," he shouted from inside his office yet again. Rule number 6 came to my house. I didn't know what to do. The following seconds were met with complete silence, neither of us wanting to ponder the implications of monsters that could come to your house. During the silence, I decided I might as well make some coffee. After all, I just missed out on a good night's rest. I entered the diner proper and moved toward the coffee machine, prepping it for two. "How do you take your coffee?" was the only response I could manage as the reality of the situation hit me. "They came to my house." Black, the one-word response cleared my head of those thoughts as I quickly got back to making my coffee, wondering if Thomas was thinking the same thing. The coffee finished quickly and I decided to make the most of the opportunity that had presented itself. Thomas and I were alone with some coffee. It was time for answers. I opened the office door to see Thomas sitting in his office chair, behind his desk in deep thought. "Your coffee, sir," I said as I approached him, walking slowly as if he were a lion that might pounce if I moved too quickly. I handed him the coffee, his eyes never once meeting mine as I did so. "Are you all right, sir?" I tried making eye contact, wanting to bring him back from his distant stare, but to no avail. "I'm fine, son. Just sit down and we can talk," the man's gruff voice returned. I felt like I had somehow annoyed him, but I figured he just needed some time to think about the situation. What interested me a lot more was how he knew I wanted to talk. I hadn't let on anything about that yet. "Well, sir, I wanted to ask you about the cafe." I did my best to ask as sincerely as possible, needing these answers more than anything. "You know I can't tell you about that, you idiot." The gruff tone was all that greeted me yet again, being shut down before I could really ask anything. "But sir, I need to know," I pleaded wildly, hoping he would reconsider. "I can't tell you, Jay. Not until your management, but given the circumstances I can give you a bit more to go on." I waited in anticipation for him to continue, hoping that I would finally get some answers. "You ever wonder who owns this place?" It was a question I had never considered to be a possibility. It was Thomas after all, wasn't it? You see, I'm just the manager. I don't actually own the place, he continued. The owners are the cafe, so they're the owners. Finally, something useful. Okay, but why? Why do they keep this place running? Surely it isn't profitable? I asked this with mild bemusement. I always suspected this place couldn't be turning a profit, but I never thought someone else was bankrolling the place. Well, they need someone to take care of the leftovers. And that someone is us. My mind filled with even more questions, but there wasn't nearly enough time to get answers to them all. Ruby would be showing up for work soon after all. I could get one more important thing answered. You've talked about the leftovers. What are they? I held my breath, hoping that somehow this would be the key that unlocks it all. Thomas took a deep sigh, clearly wanting to avoid questions like these, but I hope nonetheless. They're the ones that come to us. The cafe fights them, and we deal with whatever comes out the other end. Thomas paused after this, wondering if he had said too much. What do you mean they fight them? I asked in hopes he would give me one more answer. They exercise them. The finality in his voice clued me off. This would be the last answer I would get, but it was also the most important. They exercise them. They must be demons or something then, right? We drank our coffees in silence after that. He was obviously unwilling to let on anything else, and I was scared to make him. After I finished my coffee, I left his office, with Ruby arriving not long after. I told Ruby what had happened and the answers Thomas had given me. And soon enough she was as curious as me. I got more answers throughout the day. But my posts have been running a little long, so I'll tell you about that next time. About the people from the cafe who visited us.